2. Scars. So it's overcomplicated ulama, Ichtak laughed, absently flicking a marble from before his knees where he rested on the floor. It bounced over the stone rim of the little mock ball court opposite him. No, it's not overcomplicated ulama, chided a familiar voice, equally tinged with laughter. Its high pitch was warm birdsong to his ears, sweeping him almost immediately into comfort and placid ease. Then why in Shalutlan's halls are there so many damned rules? It's bad enough someone's taken the sport out of a real game by shrinking it down. Then they have to go on about angles and points like book-drunk scholars afraid of the moon. It's to balance the game for 2 players, troglodyte, the voice returned. If you'd listen, you'd understand. I swear before Harakwe, one moment you're sharp like obsidian and the next you're dense as a llama. It was fast, familiar talk, the false fencing of old companions. There was laughter lurking just beneath the surface of their jibes. Ichtak, grinning a breed of disarmed grin he'd not worn in years, flicked another marble hard, arcing it upward to thud against his opponent's thigh. His eyes rose to meet Shatal's. He couldn't find them, though. The familiar, slight, slender form of him was there, seated before Ichtak. But as his gaze fumbled in search of Shatal's own, and his mind raced to formulate a quick retort, his tentative glance revealed only blood and torn flesh, the copper-dirtied white of a spine all that was left to peer back from the stump which had once held the youth's head. Fresh streams of crimson trickled from the ruined neck's edges and down to stain the bare chest of the corpse thing. It leaned forward, stretching out a groping hand for Ichtak's face. His own arm snapped weakly up to ward it off, to keep it away from him at all costs, his breath halting in his throat as he bore witness once again to Shatal just as he had been that nauseous, soul-shaking morning 2 years prior. Then his eyes truly opened, revealing a dimly lit tent hosting only his cot, shelves of vaguely medical supplies and intimidating steel tools, and a few harsh metal stools. To his shock, there was also a young man, whose arm Ichtak had gripped tight when he lurched up in panic from sleep. For one cloudy moment as he scrambled to place himself, to remember anything about these surroundings, he thought the young man before him actually was Shatal.
Apologies, Your Majesty,
the stranger said, his breath caught in his throat and his eyes widening. Its tone was light, but it was unmistakably not Shatal's, nor was the dark-furred and spotted arm the smooth gray of Shatal's. The mild Lautani accent and formal address brought him back into reality. Though the unfamiliar feline had done well to suppress his shock, even the shaken Ichtak saw that the stranger had been equally startled by his sudden lurch from sleep. Ichtak caught his breath, letting the feline go. Even the slow shift of his arm back down to rest along his right side sent the all-too-tangible rippling of cold, tense agony swelling through his torso. He fast sunk back to a prone position on the cot, gritting his teeth against yet more waves of pain issuing from his leg. Memories of the charge into the Grand Commons came cascading back onto him, sending him scrambling for details in the murk which he couldn't quite discern. Finding it slightly painful to breathe, he collected himself for a moment in the awkward silence which followed before asking, "What's happened?" Pain, dull but slow to dissipate, drummed a menacing rhythm along the side of his skull as he spoke. Cautious to use his left arm and keep his back flush with the cot, he brought his hand up to examine his head. "Don't," the stranger urged, cautiously but directly leaning in again towards his right side. Ichtak obeyed, relaxing his arm, still trying to catch his breath as the stranger explained. "You've been injured in the field, Your Majesty. The court physicians entrusted those of us following you here on the front to care for you while you recover enough for the transfer back to Tepeklan." "And the battle in Eztlan?" "A victory," the stranger assured, placing a ginger hand against Ichtak's skull just beneath his right eye. The soft noise of bandaging being carefully inspected was unmistakable. "You'll need to remain still, if you can, while you're here, Your Majesty," the young stranger went on, inspecting the dressings before moving down his body to examine his right thigh beneath the thin blanket of the cot. This revealed to Ichtak both the grotesque bruising emanating out from around the bandaging there, and the startling fact that he was nude save for a compression wrap around his chest. He came quite close to shifting away, only halting himself by focusing on the still present echoes of the pain which had accompanied his earlier motion. Ichtak tried not to watch the attendant as he began to gently strip the bandages along his leg, making a short trip to the nearby shelves before returning to clean the discolored flesh around his sutured bayonet wound with practiced care. "Your broken ribs will heal with rest, and your leg will be much the same," he explained, the cool press of water being followed by the needling of alcohol against the gash as he worked. "The eye and face have been patched up as well, Your Majesty. In 2 months or so you will be back on your feet." "Aye." Ichtak's earlier motion to look down toward his leg wound had left him feeling slightly off, perturbed by something he couldn't place. He'd lost the vague sensation in a rush of nervousness over his lack of clothing, but now the worry found room to creep back in. "Yes, Your Majesty," the stranger said. "The explosive the rebel used was a weak one, and the shrapnel only scratched at your side through your uniform. It must have been close to your head, though. There will be scarring along the right side of your face and around your ear. The right eye was cut and burned, and the court physician thought it best to remove it." He finished applying the clean bandages and then rose, turning to face Ichtak again. The prince tried to dismiss the childish notion, but the young Lautani man, probably an orderly or apprentice from the local province a couple years shy of his own age, made his chest lurch as he actually observed him for the first time. He had angular features and lithe grace, small but flowing. His neck had a swan's lengthy poise, and his cat's eyes were the soft turquoise of tropic water, their color slightly exotic, seeming by some sorcery wholly devoid of magic to read and soothe the fear that must have haunted his features even before he could voice it. "They will be strong scars to recount the story of your bravery," the stranger told him. "The entire garrison is buzzing about your charge, Your Majesty. The whole of the Empire is." The feline seemed to hesitate, and despite Ichtak's attempts to curb his rapidly devolving train of thought, he filled the silence which descended with all kinds of imagined action. Perhaps the stranger had meant to reach out and grasp his shoulder, to reassure him, but had remembered to whom it was he spoke and forced himself to abstain. Then swept in the cool voice of hard reason, reminding him that he may well be drugged, imagining tones and expressions that were not there. Still, in the moment, that did nothing to quell his heart. It was no wonder in his mind that he had awakened to thoughts of Shatal. "I will try to bear them well," Ichtak said clumsily, referencing an old line about battle scarring in Harakwe's holiest book, The Bastion of Will. It was all he could think to say. "You will." The stranger smiled, seeming nervous, making some shameful part of Ichtak almost certain he was equally befuddled. The prince made to return the expression, but managed only a nervous softening of his features, suddenly all too conscious of the fact that he had no way of knowing what his face looked like from his cot. Waves of anxiety were becoming a normality of this new, wounded world. "What is your name?" "Setiawan, Your Majesty," the stranger answered, turning to dispose of Ichtak's old bandage. "Feel welcome to call me Seti, though. It is simpler for Sholoshaitians to remember." "Setiawan," Ichtak repeated, trying to place the attendant's faint, almost shifting accent. "Where are you from?" "About 20 miles northwest of here, Your Majesty. from a rich little fishing town called Adipelabuhan. I started as an apprentice to Royal Physician Tepecoat 3 months ago. Ichtak had known a few people of the Lautani kindred from the southern peninsula by name in the capital, and had met a sizable number engaged in the Sholoshaitan legions since leaving Tepeclan on campaign. He could at last place the rising, almost sing-song note to some of Setiawan's words. This peninsula and its Sholoshaitan renamed capital of Eztlan were the most recent annex of Sholoshaidi's mighty dominion, an old territory of the seafaring Lautani Duumvirate, who brooded serpent-like across the waves in eternal opposition to her continental adversary, urging on in bated whispers the rebels who had injured him and so many others in her name. Here before him stood a Lautani-born aide to the court physicians. It seemed to lend the feline's words all the more weight. "Since you've woken up, I'll go fetch the High Marshal," Setiawan told him. "He's been hovering near the tent since you arrived. He'll want to speak with you." As much a relief as he knew seeing Ruhualpa would be, Ichtak's stomach sank to see Setiawan bow low and turn for the exit. "It was good to meet you, Setiawan," Ichtak offered, the words feeling forced, becoming foolish even as he spoke them. Setiawan turned, bowing once more, saying, "And an honor to meet you, Your Majesty." Setiawan graced Ichtak with another smile, and then pushed out from the tent, Ichtak catching a whiff of the Southland's salt-scented ocean breeze on the nocturnal air beyond as he went. The prince was left in silence with the buzzing and chirping of the night's insects outside, figuring it must be late indeed for the sounds of celebrating officers or camp commotion to have died away in the darkness beyond his canvas walls. Left with only his thoughts and no distractions, his thoughts crawled with frightening speed back to his eye. Craning his head lightly so as not to distress his battered torso, he looked around the sparse room, trying to tell if he could distinguish the world he now saw from the world he might have seen before the charge on the Grand Commons. Other than the clarified shape of his nose now more clearly stalking the edge of his field of vision, he noticed nothing, though he imagined he would feel the restriction of his peripheral vision more when he was on his feet, stripped of the sore, omnipresent aches and needling jabs of cool pain which now gripped him. For the moment he found it remarkable how little the eye's loss disturbed him. He blinked, paying close attention to the sensation for the first time since his awakening, and making certain to attempt motion beneath the barely tangible weight of the bandaging constricting his head. Ichtak was certain the flesh just beneath the brow twitched there, just as it did on his left, but there was no brush of moving lid along the bandaging. All that followed was a dull, perhaps drug-dampened burn along the right side of his face. There came a telltale fall of brisk, precise steps outside, and Ichtak forgot about his worry once more, discomfort extinguished all at once. Ruhualpa must have been close indeed, bursting through the tent flap in the hurried manner that characterized the lean officer. The High Marshal pushed his way into view, his hyena's snout bared in a smile. The nomadic and pastoral kindred of the northeastern plains had in early days been called savages, but the incorporation of a significant population into the Empire's dominion as vassals had softened that label somewhat. Now, the hyena-like kindred were called by the name they gave themselves, the Kandari. Ruhualpa Mirakanchi, a prime specimen of his people in appearance alone, was just under 6 feet tall, males tending to be the significantly smaller of the Kandari sexes, and averaging out around the same size as a Sholoshaitan man. He sported a sleek coat of almost golden fur, the hue of grassland horizons, tinted here and there with the grays of middle age. It was there the similarities to the plains warriors ended, though, Ruhualpa's upbringing in Sholoshaiti having instilled the venerable officer with the imperious bearing of Tepeclan, rather than the lunatic fury of the open savannah. "It's been nearly 3 days you've slept," Ruhualpa exclaimed, his face a grandfather's gently mocking grin. "I half expected to be dragging you back to Tepeclan before next we spoke." His almost hoarse tones filled the small space, and Ichtak took silent delight at the jingling of the metals decorating his mentor's sweeping greatcoat as the Kandari took up a seat on one of the small stools around the bed. It was the diction of a native speaker conveyed on vocal cords not meant for Sholoshaishan speech, a familiar, softly growling cadence that warmed the prince's heart. When he had sought to learn to shoot and hunt in youth, Ruhalpa had taught him. When he had sought a wooden sword to slay imaginary beasts, Ruhalpa had helped him carve it. When he came with questions about Sholoshaiti or the wider world, Ruhalpa had answered with the calm interest an adult would show a peer. Even when he had fallen under the wrath of his mother, Ruhalpa had been there to reassure and steer him, just as he had done in childhood, the adopted outlander turned commander commiserating with his young charge, while also giving him perspective on his duty to the country he was to lead. He had shown the prince new purpose. Ichtak realized then, for the first time, how glad he was to have lived to see the High Marshal again. "The uprising is broken, I'm sure you'd like to know," Ruhalpa told him. "We cordoned off the city well enough that most of the surviving enemy are being shipped off to Tepeclan for sacrifice, but I'm sure we'll be finding a few ragged escapees in the jungles as time passes by. You're to be sent back home, however. You've earned a break from suffering the mosquitoes and snakes of the Southland." The attendant had mentioned that. "Has Her Highness called me back home herself?" "She has, but I wouldn't worry about her anger if I were you," Ruhalpa told him, effortlessly sniffing out the root of his question. "The whole of the empire is alight with the talk of Estlan, and the papers clogging street corners and newsstands all bear your name. The War Council have organized a triumph, and you are to lead it to the temple. If Her Highness or her new industrialist advisors are disturbed by your bold behavior, she would do well not to say so. It would not reflect well upon her." Ichtak remained silent, brooding in discomfort over the mental image of his mother doing much the same. Ruhalpa, looking on, gave him a moment before continuing. "You performed with great bravery," Ruhalpa said. "I have heard great things from your accompanying officer corps. You're an observant commander, not above the lessons I've long tried to teach you. While I can't say I was pleased to learn how often you risked the thickest of the fighting, I can say I'm proud." Ichtak smiled. He was glad to hear words of praise from Ruhalpa, even if he was somewhat embarrassed by them. But the expression did not last long. He changed the subject, suddenly needing answers to rising questions which had been lurking just beneath the surface, ready to burst into view. "Ever since waking, I've kept blinking and breathing in time, focusing in on the ache in my head, trying to convince myself I'm actually here," Ichtak said, voicing thoughts he was only just coming to grasp. "I suppose I actually am. What worries me is that I can't put a finger on why." Until that final melee, Ichtak had been immune to such questions. Youthful sparring and martial training had dulled him to threats and the promise of pain, and he had sprinted through the days fighting like an excitable pup through riveting new surroundings, the danger which had stalked each eager step accepted as an almost exciting matter of course. For a while, the thunder of combat had swept away worries of home, and the humiliation that had haunted him there. Then he had laid his gaze upon death in the city's upper tiers. The stairs and the commons beyond had submerged him in it, coated him in the blood of his own slain countrymen. The rebel's bayonet in that barely remembered blast had brought the sheer, random chance of it all crashing down on him in slow, plodding waves. Only tangible once distance had brought him clarity through the fog of the day's adrenaline and fury. Ruhalpa, not needing elaboration, tapped the side of the prince's bed with his knuckles absently, leaning back as best his unforgiving perch allowed and saying, "I had seen several battles by the time I marched for Hurabaya with the 9th Legion. I would have been just shy of 30 in the summer of 87. I wasn't ready for what awaited us there." Ichtak knew the battle well. His lessons had long ago sparked a love of true, flesh-and-blood narratives of Sholoshaitan grit and martial hardship in him. Though the Laot Sholoshaitan War of 3987 to 88 had been short and contained, it had been fought with legendary brutality, the perfect fodder for gut-wrenching and chilling memoirs and dramatizations. When the Lautani elephant cavalry routed our outriders and mounted their surprise assault, I and my men had the misfortune of being caught in the open, along with the rest of the infantry. Ruhalpa recalled, his face upturned to observe the blank canvas above him. They came on fast. I think the noise was the worst of it. The guns thrumming in the howdahs and the feet of the things thumping closer and closer. The riders chanting and the beasts huffing and snorting. I still can't remember much of what happened after we went to ground and did what we could to ward them off with rifle fire, said Ruhalpa, eyes narrowed. Our heavy weapons were already ahead at the front, and there were only a few aging heavy guns in that part of the company. When the stamping and shooting fell silent and I found myself hobbled with a shattered leg, I pulled myself from the corpses to find that there were only 17 men left of my original 80, including myself. My command was shattered, and there was nothing I could have done to shore up the flank with our outriders, or anticipate the breakthrough from my position on the lower fields. Even worse was the charge itself, though, Ruhalpa said, shaking his head. I hadn't run. I hadn't stood more firmly or fought more bravely than the others. It could have been me, the bullets and tusks and crushing pads found there in the tall ferns hugging the dirt, angering armored elephants with my little rifle. Ichtak watched Ruhalpa mull his next words over, the Kandari's dark eyes still wandering the canvas of the tent above. There are those who will tell you that you've been blessed by Harakwe, Ruhalpa said, kept alive for purposes only he can divine. I can't pretend to know with certainty the designs of the old general, but I've come to think about the matter quite often in my time. Harakwe is both father and reaper, Ruhalpa mused, referencing an old Sholoshaitan religious dictum. There is a date stamped on each and every one of his sons. The hour of any man's death cannot be known to any save Harakwe, nor can it be altered in his ledger. If you were fated to die yesterday and had fled from the field to cower in the tents, he would have stricken you down there, at the very same minute written for you in his tome of honors and dishonors. The only thing you, I, or any other soldier of Harakwe can do is strive to die in the way we were meant to die, to struggle with courage, to spit in the face of the enemies of Sholoshaitan until life itself is ripped away, and we are whisked off to join our Creator in battle everlasting on the fields of fire and war down below. Your men died fighting, struggling to bring their steel to the foe, Ruhalpa said, his finger leveled at the prince. They did not live to see themselves grow old and rot within their own bodies. They died in the prime of their strength. They died as a man should, on his ascent, rather than whiling away the years in decline like a dementia-addled woman, clinging to each comfort and familiarity until she can remember them no more. Harakwe can ask no greater honor from his sons than this. Ichtak nodded, mulling over the words for a moment. It is the distance that troubles me, Ichtak mused. That men who'd never seen the faces of their executioners were cut down by bullets hundreds of yards from their lines. It feels a shame to live in this age, where most men die without being within arm's reach of each other. without testing the mettle of their foes. Yes, Ruhualpa agreed, his predator's eyes gleaming with memory. I often wish I had been born in the Age of Blades. Of course, I might have been riding with the hordes of the Boags and Kandar in those earlier ages. It would mortify me to know some earlier echo of mine had spilled the blood of the Empire's men. It doesn't steal away the attraction, though. Ruhualpa shook his head then, letting the imaginings of past ages fade, and saying, "War is war, though. It is, as ever, the undisputed domain of Harakwe, the old general. His eye is upon you, even in the direst hour upon the field." Ichtak fell silent, pondering, running through the commons once more in his mind. Ruhualpa, rising to his feet, leaned in and tapped his shoulder with more restraint than his energetic manner usually demanded, careful to only gently rattle the prince's injured frame. "There is no shame in having been graced by what ignorant men call good fortune, for there is no fortune in war," said Ruhualpa. "We all step off the stage at different times. Your day will come, as will mine, both on the field, Harakwe willing. We can only make the best of the days in between." He pulled away, managing a smile despite the darkness in his eyes. "Sleep well if you can, Ichtak," Ruhualpa told him. "If your physicians will clear it, we'll begin a relaxed ride by train to the outskirts of Tepeklan tomorrow. We'll want you back on your feet before the triumph, and I think the clean highland air will do you good while you rest." Ichtak let his form slacken, coming fully to rest against the pillows and cot again as he watched Ruhualpa push his way out into the humid tropic night. When the quiet white noise of nocturnal insects closed in again, and Ichtak's scattered mind found much-needed sleep once more, that sleep was blessedly dreamless.